Okay, well, I would like to welcome you to our conference today at the Old Mill. We're very excited to have everybody. I am Beth Williston. I am the president of OAIA, and I am also with the Toronto and Region Conservation Authority. We're very excited with a very packed program, so I'm going to move through the beginning slides. Once we get past the beginning, I'll move through some of the business slides quite quickly so we can get into the conference and we can learn about how we are going to fundamentally get things done. Did it switch? All right. The first thing I would like to do is I would like to welcome Jaga Tagamich to the podium to give us a traditional welcoming. At the same time, Gary will be moving through the room, smudging the room, and when he is done, you are welcome to join Gary personally at the back of the room if you'd like to do an individual smudging as well. Okay.
Ani, bonjour, Sego, good morning. My name is Chimatigamish, which means the great big oak tree. And so I'm supposed to behave that way, welcoming everyone that comes my way, taking care of everyone that comes my way. And I come to you today so that I might give you some words that will inspire you to think in a different way. I have with me sweetgrass. It's a man's plant, and it's used for smudging. I have with me the eagle feather. And this bird gets as close to the Creator as anything on earth. They've even seen the eagle flying outside passenger jets. The eagle is at that level. And if we were going higher, maybe we'd see the eagle up higher. And I tell you this so that we start looking up, away from ourselves, to something that is greater than us. Something that we all in this room are working toward. Something greater than us. The braid is very strong. You can't break this if you try. And so we are taught as men to bind our spirits, our minds and our hearts together to make us all strong individuals. And we learn how to combine our communities into three so that we can be strong as a people, a nation, or many nations. And I offer this teaching to you so that you might take it and understand that you can braid yourselves together to make your union stronger. And we can do that by the networking bingo. We can do that by opening our minds to what I'm about to say and opening yourself up for a smudge. There is no right or wrong way to smudge, and we didn't bring any smudge police with us, so we're all good out here. When I'm done speaking, Gary at the back there will smudge anyone who wants to go over and partake. We're not asking you to practice religion. We're asking you to to open yourself. I'll say again, open yourself up to what you are going to hear here. And I pray that each one of us gets to hear the message and not get caught up in words. And that's very important to conducting business in a good way. I want to mention at this time, I have a daughter who was chief of our community, and she came up with this idea as we're talking about the ego and echo. Ego is top down, echo is equal and around. We're all at the same level here today. So there's no one of us who is better than the person beside them. We are equal. And if we can think in terms of equal, it'll help us to address those issues that come forward to us through the businesses we're tied up in. I'd like to thank you all for coming here this morning to be a part of this engagement and to learn. That's a very honorable concept to be involved in. Honor. And so with this sweet grass, I ask the Creator to bring down some humbleness to us so that we can shed our coats of anxiety and stress and relax into what we're going to do here today. I want to pray and be thankful for the fact that we all got here safe and sound. And I'd like to address those people who cannot be here but would like to be. Those people who would like to be here but can't because of limitations on their being. I know people who can't take care of themselves. They need care all the time. And so I want you to think about anyone you might know who would enjoy being here but isn't. And invite their spirit in to join you at your table so that we can still take from the strength that those people offer in their special ways. I was talking about echo, and the echo is tied to our belief system in that I'm no better than a skunk or a squirrel or a muskrat. We are equal. So if I have some work that comes to me that's going to affect the muskrat, then I have to take time to clear my mind, clear my heart, and dust off my spirit so that I can do that in a good way. I want to be thankful at this time for the ability to take care of ourselves this morning as we did to get here. Be thankful for that ability. In the business that we are in, there are hierarchies that can't be avoided. And that's the ego. We have to pay attention to those two ways of believing if we want to be effective in what we're trying to do. I'm very appreciative to be asked to come here and address this group. I feel from you this desire to move ahead. From all these tables, I'm getting this. And move ahead you will after today and tomorrow. We will be brand new people when we're done this conference. And in that newness, we can approach the people we work with in a good way so that they're welcome into what we're doing. Because when you feel welcome, you can get things done. So welcome here today and tomorrow. And I'd like to thank you for listening to me at this time. I'd like to go on and on and on. Once I get a microphone, I'm happy. But I'm not going to. Thank you all for the reverence you've shown me while I'm up here speaking, the dignity in which you behave, and your attention. I'm thankful for all those things. And if you start giving them to each other, this room will be a lot warmer. So once again, miigwech, 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 miigwech. Oh.
Miigwech. And again, I want to reiterate, I want to actually thank Jagatai Gamich for offering me a personal smudging before the conference began. And please do go to Gary at the back if it's something that you would like to do. If you haven't done it before, Gary is a wonderful teacher, and please join him. Do you want me to keep going? Should I keep going? Okay. Okay. We're going to wait for a few minutes before the land acknowledgement. Thank you.
It's nice. I feel well. When you got a good team,
Any idea how honored I am?
I was just coming up to see that you went on that.
to say thank you again. Hello. Hi. All right, again, I want to thank Jagategamich, Gary, and Heidi for the smudging, and I'm going to move forward with the land acknowledgement now. The Ontario Association I'll start again. The Ontario Association for Impact Assessment acknowledges that our meeting is taking place on treaty land. Hello? All right. The Ontario Association for Impact Assessment acknowledges that our meeting is taking place on treaty land that is steeped in rich First Nation history. We also acknowledge that this land is the territory and treaty lands of the First Nation of the First Peoples of Turtle Island. It is shared between the Mississauga of the Credit, as well as the Anishinaabe of the Williams First Treaty and the Haudenosaunee, and it is now home to many diverse First Nation peoples. We acknowledge their generations of stewardship, and we strive to have a relationship with this land as they did, and reverse the impacts created by our ancestors and modern-day policy and decisions. Today, we acknowledge our shared responsibility for caring for this land that we depend on to nourish our bellies and our minds. We commit to working together in respecting the beauty, safety, and security that this land provides. We will act as partners in preserving this land, together with the animals and habitats that depend on it for generations to come. On a personal note, I'd like to talk about the land of Ontario and the connection that I am feeling very fortunate to have, largely in a canoe or a car. To be able to canoe and paddle the Don River, or to paddle through the many rivers of Algonquin, or through the Gatineau River in Quebec. It's an honor, and when I am in the canoe or the kayak, I'm really able to have a lot of introspection for sure, and then respect for the peoples that were here before the settlers came, and this is their land and their water and how they survived and lived and thrived, and it's an honor to be able to be a part of that. And then to drive across our province and through our province and to see the beautiful environment which we live in, and that we can strive to take nourishment and replenish our minds and our bodies as well. It's so important. OAIA acknowledges the forced past and current actions of settlers, that they have had unwillfully created the foundation of Canadian history today. We are dedicated to honoring First Nation history, culture, and most importantly, treaty. OAIA is committed to moving forward in truth and understanding of the spirit of reconciliation and respect for First Nations. I'd now like to thank our sponsors for today, and we do have many. Our Indigenous sponsor is Hatch. Our gold sponsors, Stantec, Jacobs, HDR, and TRCA. Our silver sponsors, GHD, Dillon, Vigoni, and Willimanshire. Bronze, WCS, Clear, Parsons, Arup, and Intrinsic. And our break sponsor is Hardy Stevenson. Thank you all. Without the sponsorship, we simply could not run the conference. It's very much appreciated. I'd also like to thank our speakers today and tomorrow, of which we have many. Every year, OAIA donates towards a speaker's gift to what we consider a valued institution. And this year we chose Eco Schools. EcoSchools supports environmental leadership and climate action in schools. They offer a certification program for elementary through secondary schools, nurturing environmental learning and climate action. They're innovative and bilingual. The certification program is free for publicly funded schools. It helps to incentivize and track and reward environmental actions that reduce energy and waste, raise awareness, and incorporate environmental learning into the curriculum. We have donated $500 towards their work. Now for a little bit of housekeeping. You'll see on your tables there are network bingo cards. I think you were given them at registration. If you don't have it, go and grab one. It's fun. And throughout the conference, fill in the squares. When it's filled, take it back to the registration desk and drop it in the box there. And then we'll be doing a draw at the end of the day for a chance to win a free membership for next year. I think if you've been reading our emails and our posts, you know that we are celebrating 30 years of OAIA this year in 2024. And it's quite an honor to be standing here on the 30th anniversary. We do have a Slido. I guess I don't want to say it's a game, but some questions that we'll be asking you. And you'll see it on the next slide when I flip as well. So if you want to just grab your cameras and get that QR code. I think you can, the questions that you'll be asked are actually on the slide right now. We want to know what the first assessment process you worked on in your professional career with, and with whom did you work? So for me, it was the Interim Waste Authority right out of university with our manager of the day at TRCA. And it was quite an honor to work with her. Okay, everybody's got that? And also, in terms of connecting, another little bit of business, the password for the Wi-Fi, the old mill, is Impact. If you're using social media, and we absolutely encourage you to use social media, just please, if you could tag us in at hashtag OAIA 2024, that'd be fabulous. And you can also follow, and if you're not already, we encourage you to follow us on Twitter, LinkedIn, and Facebook. All right, so I'm now going to introduce you to our chair of our moderators. It's Blair Strockinger. Might not have said that quite right, sorry. And he is going to lead the conference program now.
Thanks, Beth. Good morning, everyone. How's everyone doing? Excited? Ready to go? Fantastic. It's amazing to see so many familiar faces. I'll just give a shout out to our table. I'm sitting with some people that they started their career working together, and now some of us are still working together. I see some other faces in the crowd where we've worked together in the past, and so it's fantastic to see everyone here together. And you know, the venue here is great. We've got a little bit more space, so hopefully you can make your way around and connect with people. It's a great opportunity to connect here with folks who are coming in from all over the city, all over the country. Actually, you'll see, and have some conversations on projects and experiences that they're having. I'm going to just do a quick thank you again for session number 1, our gold sponsors. So thank you to Stantec, Jacobs, TRCA, and HCR. And our first session is on managing uncertainty. So if I could call up the speakers for the first session, as well as our moderator. First session is going to be moderated by Sarah Miriam, who's the Environmental Director at Parsons.
we'll just wait a couple minutes until people are set up, but anybody that's presenting in session 1, so innovations in field studies and EAs, nuclear projects, impact assessment, impacts of today's decisions on uncertain tomorrow, and exploring the landscape of post-environmental assessment support. Come on up and sit down. Oh, no, come on up. Thank you. Okay, great. So this is the start of session 1, Managing Uncertainty. Our first presenter is Kim Laframboise, who is a senior ecologist at HDR in the Environmental Sciences and Planning Group. She specializes in terrestrial and aquatic ecology, risk management, wildlife biology, species at risk, and contractor education. She has 18 years experience and has extensive experience navigating the environmental assessment process and legislative framework. She's eager to share her experiences working within our industry, from field methodologies and field data collection aspects to support biophysical assessments and land use planning, which are vital stepping stones to any EA/IA process. Her presentation is going to highlight some of the technological advances in field data collection and their use limitations, how incorporating new innovations in field studies such as environmental DNA or eDNA can benefit the EA/IA process and strike the correct balance, ensuring robust, high quality, and meaningful IA/EAs. So let's welcome Kim.
Good morning. We've all had some coffee and some pastries, some yummies. So my presentation today, it's going to be a bit of interactive. So if the more engaged you are, you might have the opportunity to potentially get some little goodies, which you can come and see me after the presentation for. This isn't set up. Yeah, no.
It's not going.
So when I heard about the theme of this year's conference, I was excited to share some of my experiences with you regarding some of the innovations and technologies that are currently out there, but also that are coming into the future. What I'm going to provide today is a little bit of tasting of some of these, so we're not going to get into the weeds, but we will sort of do a high-level scope. So if you need more information, you can come and see me after, and I can put you into touch with some additional resources. Perfect.
And then you just want to slip the slides.
Okay. For the presentation today, we're going to have a bit of an overview of what's driving some of these innovations, like, for example, different types of policies, climate change, etc. Then we're going to get into a little bit more of the weeds, and we'll have that little bit of tasting of some of those technologies that are out there and some of those innovations that we can use as a tool as ecologists, but also in our EA and impact assessments, and what that means and how that's going to drive some of the changes for us as we start to move forward with doing the projects that we do. We'll talk about some of the advantages and disadvantages, some of the challenges, I like to say, instead of disadvantage, as well as discussing as a group together. We're going to decide whether or not we are up for the challenge. Are we ready to take those next steps to start including some of these innovations into what we do as practitioners? So for me as an ecologist, and for many people in this room, a lot of the drivers is policy. And as you know, over the last few years, there's been a lot of changes to those policies. And as part of those changes, there's more of an onus on us as either a consultant, a regulator, a municipal agency, to provide more certainty in what we do from an ecological perspective. So for example, under the Migratory Bird Act, there's the changes in different designations under the ESA. There's also the changes and different role shiftings with regards to the Conservation Authorities Act, and more importantly, the new processes and additions under the Provincial Planning Statement, which is no longer the old style provincial policy statement. And then of course the Environmental Assessment Act. So I have a question. Under the Migratory Bird Act, there was 18 additional species added as a consideration. I want some people to shout out to me if they know what some of those, or one or two of those 18 species might have been, or what some of those changes might have been. Just yell it out. I heard somebody over here. Pileated woodpecker. What is another addition that was, somebody over here said something. I heard cavity nesting over here. So you're right. So come and see me after. So one of the changes, the biggest changes, was the addition of the protection of cavity and nests of 18 species beyond what we would typically use as the migratory bird breeding window. And why is that important? When we're looking at adaptations and changes of different species and how we do some of our methodologies, we have to change how we're doing that, and we have to use some of these new innovative tools to do that. So when we're doing a breeding bird survey, why do we do a breeding bird survey? What's the purpose of doing it? Yell it out. Anybody. Why do we do a survey? Right, to see what's there, to see if there's species at risk, to see what kind of habitats that might be there. And traditional ways of doing that is through things like the marsh monitoring program, through traditional breeding bird studies. But through climate adaptation and changes, a lot of species aren't following the rules, right? With last year, we had a very mild winter where a lot of amphibians were starting to breed in March. Whereas some of these guidance protocols tell us, well, we're not really supposed to do surveys until April or May or June. But what if through advancing technologies and innovation, we could get the same answers, but just a different approach? So we can use a lot of these guidance protocols that we're traditionally using as part of our EAs as practitioners, but what if we just changed the process but got the same answer? And I think through what we're trying to do with some of our processes is we need to learn how to adapt and change some of those methods which are stuck, I wouldn't say in the olden days, but they were designed as citizen science initiatives, way back when, like a number of years ago, and we haven't really changed them. So that's one of the drivers for this innovation. Another driver for innovation is this. And what is this, you might ask? If you look closely on the screen, there are some little tidbits. What do we see when we look at this? Anybody? What do you see? Other than just trees, do you see anything else? There's some hidden pieces in there. There's some clusters of something. Bats, that's right. So bats is like a very big thing for us here. But if we use traditional methods of data collection, we would miss this. If you look on the left-hand side with the cluster, that's a maternity colony of tricolored bats. Our traditional methods would say you have to go out and do cavity searches, you'd have to have multiple staff on site doing those surveys. But what if, through technology and advances in innovation, you could do that and get that certainty that we're looking for? For example, we need to know if it's species at risk habitat for our processes. What if we could do that in one day, rather over a full season? Another factor that's driving a lot of changes and innovations is generally our project needs have changed, right? With a lot of the advances in some of our policies, we want things to be more efficient. We want things to be more streamlined. We want things to be more done in a more timely manner, right? We also want things to be consolidated from competing interests. We have ecology, we have design, we have stakeholders consultation. There's all these competing interests that we have to think about. But what if we could manage some of that uncertainty when we're starting out our projects and our budgets and our timelines through some of the innovations that we're going to talk about today? And then lastly, budgets and costs. So this is a big one. This is another big driver for innovation, right? But it can also be potentially a hesitance to incorporate it into what we do every day. So from a project design, sometimes stakeholders don't understand some of these new technologies, so they're hesitant to incorporate or use them. Sometimes the review process or the collaboration, some people want it, some people don't. So it can be really challenging, and that is a driver as well. So to get into a bit more of the meat and potatoes, We're going to touch on some of the ones that are more commonly occurring right now that are either currently on the ground with concept proof, or there's a lot of really good potential and we're making exceptional strides moving forward with them. So the first one to talk about is your UAV. We're all using UAVs. We know that they're out there. We can use them for topographic surveys. We can take really cool pictures with them, but they're not your average drones anymore. There are so many more things that we can use with UAVs that we're just not tapping into. But there are researchers, there are people down in Texas using, for example, UAVs to do ecological land classification, where instead of sending a biologist out in the field, using the challenges that biologists might have, so timing, project budgets, you can now send a UAV where areas maybe you don't have permission to access or permission to enter, and you can collect sometimes, if not higher quality data, through LiDAR, photo imagery, remote sensing, but also infrared as well. And some of the more unexpected pieces that a lot of people don't think about is that you can actually use drones to collect data. So what if you couldn't access a certain area because of limitations with health and safety? You could potentially use a UAV to collect insects for your insect surveys. You could use UAV to collect water for water samples, to talk about our next option, which is environmental eDNA. This is the forefront, which is kind of the hot topic right now, not just in Ontario, but throughout North America and even abroad. There's a lot of companies that are dabbling in this. There are some that are making a lot of strides from a university and research perspective. But it's not a novel approach anymore, but it is to biodiversity. It helps maintain some of that advances in the uncertainty question that we talk about when we're trying to get answers to our data. So it's different than regular DNA. So a lot of us right now are familiar with collecting bat guano for DNA to do species identification. That is not environmental DNA. Environmental DNA is, for example, using the techniques of a UAV or somebody collecting water and identifying a whole suite of species in one sample. Can you imagine streamlining all of your project deliverables for, say, a Class EA in 1 or 2 visits rather than doing multiple season, multiple field work? There's a lot of potential there. So this is a fox snake down in Windsor. If you've ever tried to do habitat surveys for snakes, it can be quite challenging to get the right timing, the right weather, the right surveyors with expertise, the right location. And this would not be a space that you would expect to find a hibernaculum for a fox snake coming into an area. We would not think of this. But this is protected under the ESA, and when you're trying to check that box, do you have species at risk? We can miss this with traditional surveys. But what if you could use eDNA from air to take samples within a specific area, and you could determine that you had fox snake in your location? Or what if you could use eDNA for air for this lovely specimen over here? This will be set aside at the back. If you can guess what species this is, then there will be a prize. I'll have like a little area there for you to answer the question. But what if you had a species like this that you could identify through air, rather than trying to do multiple bird surveys, trying to figure out the nest, and you could scope down your surveys to be more cost efficient and timely for your project? But eDNA is not without its challenges. It's still on the forefront. There is a lot of individual and companies that are making strides with this, but there are challenges to this. But we can't overcome those challenges unless we start incorporating them and using them in our projects. Acoustic analysis is one that we're pretty much, a lot of us are familiar with. I included this one because we're not just using acoustic analysis for bats anymore. We can do it for insects. We can do it for fish. There's a lot of more there's a lot more ways that we can incorporate acoustic analysis into our work. Another cool one is detection dogs. We're very familiar with cadaver dogs for things like archaeological burial sites, but what if you could use these types of dogs to sniff out maternity roosts or roosting sites for bats? Because they are doing it. In the US, the Alaskan Fish and Wildlife Services are using this technology to identify little myotis roosting sites, because they found that using acoustic analysis alone or visual identification by ecologists was not creating the certainty that they were looking for. And they needed something that was more efficient and more timely, that they didn't have to be constrained with a typical bat window, say in June or July, or when the bats might or may not be there, where they could pick up the smell of the guano through detection dogs. Another interesting one is the remote sensing and camera work, which a lot of us has done, but we're incorporating AI now into that process. What if you could use AI to quicken up the process of species identification of your camera traps? All of these types of things lead to a more robust and higher quality EA product for us. Meaningful data. We have to consider and improve on these aspects, but we can use them as a tool to incorporate them in our toolbox. Some of the advantage, a lot of people don't think about, these can be more cost efficient. They can be easier from a timing perspective, a budget perspective, permission to enter. They're also, if we engage early and more efficiently, we can incorporate these into our practitioners in what we do as part of our work. But they also have limitations and challenges. So for eDNA, for example, for bats, there's only a very small subset of companies that have the database for bats to use. So there's not a lot of collaboration happening right now. There's a lot of holding of that data. And we need to be more transparent and open with some of the methods that we're using, particularly if you're using it from a EA and impact assessment process versus a traditional research for like a university. Oftentimes technology is outpacing our existing guidance methods, and we can now almost be behind the times with some of the methods, and we have to try to keep up with that. And we need to be more adaptive than what we currently are. So when we're looking at the innovation and drivers and approaches to uncertainty, we have to take a step back. We have to think about all of these things. But don't panic. There's a lot here. There's a lot to know about. It can be very challenging, but there are a lot of us out there that are here to help, from experts, regulatory agencies, but are we up for the challenge? Are we up to say, you know what? Let's not worry about the method of getting that answer, but let's think about the process, as long as the answer is the same. So in our RFPs, for example, if you're an agency, you can then use some of these innovative technologies, but you have to be able to step back and think, can we use eDNA? Is that a good approach for this project? Do I need to do 3 season surveys because X said I had to do that? But the answer I want is the species there. So can I use UAV? Can I use acoustic detection where I don't have to do all of that, but I still get the same answer? And at the end of the day, all of this helps us create that more meaningful data, reduces some of those uncertainties, and help us move forward. Thank you.
That was great. Thanks so much, Kim. So we're going to wait until the end of session 1 for questions and answers. So we'll get right into session 2 now. Yes. So session 2 is from Cole Aitken and Kieran Potter, both from Calian Nuclear. Cole specializes in sustainable assessment, GBA+, Indigenous and public engagement, and strategic assessment. She spent the last 3 years working in nuclear impact assessment and licensing, but has 11 years of experience across Canada in numerous sectors, including mining, hydroelectric, and highways. She has a PhD in social and ecological sustainability from the University of Waterloo under the supervision of Bob Gibson, and was the IAIA Rita R. Ham Award recipient in 2017. She's published numerous articles on best practices, IA, and has been part of numerous research programs on next generation impact assessment. Kieran is the manager of the environmental team at Calian Nuclear. He's a nuclear engineer and impact assessment expert that leads a team of engineers and nuclear analysis in the conduct of environmental projects for Calian Nuclear, and works as a technical lead for environmental assessments and environmental risk assessment projects. He has expertise in environmental assessment, safety analysis, environmental protection, program design, among other technical disciplines. He also has a master's in nuclear engineering from the Royal Military College. So summary for the presentation is the following. Nuclear projects are subject to uncertainty due to regulatory unknowns, but this is one source of uncertainty for proponents, Indigenous nations and communities, and the public to navigate. Other sources of uncertainty including first of its kind technology, uncertainty for Indigenous nations and communities as they navigate the new IAA, nuclear expertise staffing considerations, and cultural challenges. This presentation discusses some elements of these uncertain conditions in nuclear impact assessment, and also discusses how these challenges are being met. So let's welcome Cole and Kieran.
All right, thank you. So yeah, we'll give kind of a high-level overview of new nuclear project impact assessment in Canada and some of the uncertainties that these projects are facing and how proponents are addressing these uncertainties. So overall, discussing impact assessment for new nuclear facilities in Canada, we'll talk about the key approaches for managing these. And the advancement of new nuclear builds in Canada includes extensive environmental considerations governed by both the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission's licensing requirements and the Impact Assessment Agency of Canada for IA requirements. And this is just a picture of current licensed facilities in Canada. So many in Ontario with Bruce Power, OPG, and Chalk River. And then we also have Point Lepreau in New Brunswick and Gentilly in Quebec. So just to give an overview of Calian Nuclear, we're an approved supplier for all nuclear utilities in Canada, and we're currently supporting new nuclear projects, including the Sask Power SMR project in Saskatchewan and the MB Power Advanced SMR project in New Brunswick. So our expertise includes environmental protection, radiation protection, decommissioning and waste management, nuclear safety and licensing, emergency preparedness and training, project controls and management, and system engineering and robotics.
Okay, so we're going to be talking about, like many people in this room, the new impact assessment. It's a big topic. I think you guys are probably at the right conference if you want to talk about that. So nuclear are designated projects under the Impact Assessment Act. They are under federal regulatory considerations. So just for understanding, under the physical activities regulations, what triggers a project is an activity that is on a licensed boundary site. So think the Bruce, think Lepreau, think somewhere there's already an operating nuclear reactor. And if you have a new project, and when it's combined, you have over 900 megawatts of thermal capacity. So if you have a small reactor like what's being proposed right now in Lepreau that doesn't push past that boundary, it doesn't trigger the new Impact Assessment Act. And then if it's a new project, like what Sask Power is proposing on an area that doesn't have existing nuclear facilities, if it has a thermal capacity of over 200 megawatts, then it requires the federal impact assessment. I think we can all agree that impact assessments don't happen in a vacuum, right? There are regulatory considerations and there are things that we have to understand as we move forward and all of the shifts and changes that we're all grappling with new legislation and requirements and things like that. But for nuclear, there's other areas of uncertainty as well that proponents and those who are in the field, in the nuclear industry, are really trying to grapple with. There's an uncertainty related to the role of first of its kind technology, technological ambiguity, which we'll be talking about in greater depth. There's also the uncertainty related to for Indigenous communities and their role in the assessment, and I know that there's going to be more discussions on that topic later, I think today. There's a high demand for nuclear professionals, and that causes some challenges in the industry. And also, it's a rapidly shifting culture for proponents, but also just broadly in our culture. So those things are all impacting nuclear projects moving forward. But let's move on first to first-of-a-kind technology. A bit of more understanding on that.
Okay, so some of the new nuclear projects that are advancing might be considering new technologies. So things like small modular reactors or advanced designs that include better features for safety, efficiency, or other improvements. So some examples of these new technologies include the Global First Power micromodular reactor project at Chalk River, which is a high temperature gas-cooled reactor, as well as the MB Power Advanced Small Modular Reactor program, which includes both the ARC reactor, which is a liquid sodium cooled reactor, and the Moltex molten salt reactor. So while these new designs present advantages over the previous generation of reactors, there are some uncertainties and challenges when it comes to impact assessment. So it may create challenges for defining the project parameters for the purposes of assessment. One thing that some proponents may be considering is defining a plant parameter envelope approach. So this involves creating an envelope of potential parameters where multiple designs may be under consideration. So this is one way that proponents are able to manage uncertainties associated with technologies, although it does create challenges for the impact assessment. Needing to assess a plant parameter envelope can be more costly and time-consuming for the IA, and it also means we have to consider different project scenarios that could occur, whereas with an individual design, it would be more straightforward. However, the PPE approach is accepted and has been used on a variety of projects, including the Darlington New Nuclear Project in Ontario. So another uncertainty related to new nuclear development in Canada is regulatory uncertainty. So as I mentioned, the proponents must comply with both the Impact Assessment Act and the regulatory requirements imposed by the CNSC under their framework for licensing. So the overlap between these two requirements, there are a lot of overlaps, but there are some distinct requirements that need to be considered. This creates two sets of requirements that proponents must manage. It's something that must be planned in advance to ensure that baseline studies are able to consider the requirements of both the Tailored Impact Statement guidelines and the various regulatory documents.
Okay, uncertainty for Indigenous communities and their role in the assessment process. And I think this is going to be discussed at length, so I'll discuss it from the perspective of what we're seeing for proponents at present. But there are long-standing histories between Indigenous nations and communities, project proponents, and regulatory agencies. So it needs to be considered in forward-looking relationships what that history was and how do you grapple with that as you move forward. Many communities are facing capacity issues, and I think that I'm sure that communities may talk about how many EAs and IAs and things that they have to comment on, and how for proponents that's a challenge of the timeline, but for communities it's also a real question of how do you prioritize and make decisions, and that's something that communities are really grappling with. They're seeking role in the assessment process, what their role is. They're seeking clarity, and I think that's something the agency is really working with communities on, and where proponents fit in that sort of tripartite relationship moving forward. One thing we know that makes it effective, that makes this process effective, is that communities need to be involved early to be informed and to inform the process, to decide what direction things are going to go. And if they're not involved early, then there are concerns. And also, Indigenous-led assessments are new. They're new from a regulatory perspective, and we need to know how to fully integrate those into assessment process. And factors such as community ownership of data and how that data will be used is also something that's really being considered in impact assessments now. And moving forward, what does that look like, and how do we respect community knowledge? This one I'm just going to talk about briefly, but there have been no new nuclear projects in quite a long time in Canada, and you have, if Kieran and I are people who have senior, we're not that old, right? There's a lot of people in the nuclear industry that are going to be retiring. There is a need for more nuclear professionals to fill not only, new build requirements, but also operationally and things like that, and that's something that the industry is very, very aware of and is a major point of discussion. And then I think this other topic of shifting culture for proponents is something that we're seeing proponents really trying to understand how to move forward with. Like, historically, I'm sure there's lots of people in the room that we mention nuclear and they might feel uncomfortable. But there's also people who are really excited now about nuclear projects because of climate change. So we're seeing generally in public attitude research a more positive shift towards perspectives on nuclear power, but there's still those who feel uncomfortable about developing new nuclear. And so proponents are trying to grapple with how to do that in engagement. And I will say, nuclear utilities do not do a great job historically on engagement with the public. I liken it to, I had a conversation with a colleague, that it's like you go on a first date and the person's like, I'm not an axe murderer. Like, I tell you I'm not an axe murderer, and then your first thought is, you're an axe murderer. And it's like, and sometimes nuclear leads with, we are so safe. Like, we are the safest energy source. And I think sometimes we're trying to figure out how to change the narrative so that people see nuclear as not just, this sort of scary concept, but what powers 60% of Ontario quite safely every day. So that's a big consideration. We also have to talk about also how do we communicate risk in a way that is likened to what people experience every day, and that's something that's live and a big discussion. I'd also like to note that for proponents, new projects are a new experience. When we work with them in the mining industry or hydroelectric, things have been built in more recent years, but DNMP, the Darlington New Nuclear Project, is the first new nuclear build in 30 years. So there's a lot of infrastructure that's being developed to support new projects internally for utilities. So they're very used to licensing processes, but IAs are new. And also, utilities and the nuclear industry is under significant pressure to get these projects moving forward. Just like everybody else, but with climate change objectives, there's a lot of pressure to make that happen.
Okay, so in conclusion, we summarized some of the key uncertainties that proponents are navigating when it comes to new nuclear projects in Canada. They're facing uncertainties from multiple forces, including the growth of new nuclear projects in Canada and internationally. Some of these are associated with regulatory requirements and technologies, and these are ones that we would expect to improve as some of the new projects advance. Managing all these uncertainties will require cooperation between proponents, regulators, Indigenous nations and communities, and members of the public. And engagement with Indigenous nations and communities and members of the public is shifting to become more open and transparent, which will be critical to the success of these new projects. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was very informative. We have one more presentation now before the break. I'll just load that up. No. Yes. Okay, so the last presentation before the break is going to be on adaptive management thresholds and impact assessment. And that's by Valentine Canu, who's a PhD candidate from the University of Saskatchewan, as well as Bram Noble. So come on up and here you go.
Thank you very much. Hello, everyone. I'm very excited to be here because this is a ongoing brand new project going on. I'll just get right to it. Oh, shit. What's going on here? So my name is Valentine Kanu, PhD student, University of Saskatchewan, working with Professor Bram Noble, principal investigator. He's a professor at the Department of Geography and Planning, also vice dean academic research at the University of Saskatchewan. Okay, thank you. So this ongoing project, part of my PhD project, adaptive management thresholds and impact assessment. So by way of introduction, there's an increasing recognition of the complexity of environmental and social systems. Environmental and social systems now we know there is a combination, there is an integration of social and environmental systems that's making it more difficult. And there's an increasing complexity of these systems, and this highlights the intricate interdependencies that characterize social and environmental systems. So these multi-level interactions between these components are often poorly understood. And Gain et al. 2020 emphasizes that. So the impact of many projects are uncertain and difficult to predict. So adaptive management has been recognized for dealing with these uncertainties in impact assessment, and designing sound management practices has been advocated. So adaptive management we define here as a deliberate process of testing alternative management interventions, monitoring system responses to those interventions, and adjusting these management plans as new understandings emerge. Adaptive management consists of setting thresholds that trigger the appropriate level of management responses. So in this diagram here, we try to explain that there's a safe operating space, there's a desired regime for every ecological system, and there's an undesired space. We have the confidence interval, usually 5% confidence interval in statistical design, and the 95 as well. There's a precautionary buffer, which allows for space and uncertainties when trying to manage ecological systems. Notwithstanding the vast literature on the need and importance for adaptive management, there is limited guidance on the appropriate level of thresholds in adaptive management. So this challenge has been recognized by the agency, the Impact Assessment Agency of Canada, as a major gap in Canadian impact assessment policy and guidance. And so in this research, we use these methods here where we scoped scholarly literature to see what scholars are saying on how to set thresholds in adaptive management in the context of impact assessment. And here we use the title abstract key to scope literature, and we came up with 2,503 journals or articles that speak to setting thresholds in adaptive management. We limited these between 1999 to date, and we came up with about 404 of them, where we limited to fields of environmental science, agriculture, biological sciences, social sciences. Came out to about 404 journals, further limiting these to, from 1999 to date, about 25 years time interval. We screened these texts, full screen of the text. If they spoke to targets or thresholds or limits, they were screened in. If they did not, they were screened out. And we came to about 72 of them. However, we wanted to still expand our focus, and we did we took in some other journals. So we took references that were in these 72 journals and tried to, if they spoke to anything on targets or thresholds or limits, we included them, and we came to about 137 journal articles. So screening these further, took a random sample of 40 of them and added that, we came to about 83 of them in total. So by way of results, so we came up with guiding principles and operational guidance, and we concluded that setting thresholds in impact assessment must be established based on best available science. The focus here was the importance of scientific understanding, systems and trends and causal mechanisms as foundational to setting thresholds. However, notwithstanding the focus on science foundations, other methods, other guiding principles were also discovered, right? So for the operational guidance, setting thresholds must be technically defensible. Now, statistical power, experimentation, causal mechanism hypothesis testing between alternatives was also found to be very foundational in establishing thresholds in adaptive management to reduce uncertainty. Also, accounting for certainty was very important, so to look at the probable effect limits, safe boundaries, as seen in this diagram here. So the precautionary buffer, very, very important. So safe boundaries must be set. Then it must also be responsive to learning. So the relationship between monitoring and learning was very important. So as we learn from experimentations and try to inculcate those learning into management actions. Setting threshold must also be accompanied by early warning systems. There is an integrated system of indicators on change, safe operating spaces, and associated science or limits. So this included early warning indicators, precautionary buffers, and continuum. So thresholds must be set with respect to varying levels of risks in a tiered system that specify what actions should be taken when based on monitoring information. The Bay et al. 2018 proposes this design of regulatory triggers and thresholds along a continuum. For example, we know for example, green, yellow, and red lights. So as you approach a particular threshold, it should necessitate an increasing level of management action. Setting thresholds in impact assessment also, we established, must be sensitive to scale. Here we look at natural and forced systems over time, and which should be sensitive to causal mechanisms and responses that operate at different spatial and temporal scales. So for the operational guidance, certain thresholds must be temporally relevant, and they should also be spatially relevant. It should also be informed by values. It should reflect social values, the values placed on valued components of the environment, also very, very important. It should incorporate different knowledge and value systems and establish the refinement of thresholds. Two more left for that, for the guiding principles. So setting thresholds should be actionable by managers. There's a direct link between threshold early warning systems and subsequent management actions. Setting threshold must be operational, right? So these low, medium, and high operating spaces. And setting threshold should also be accountable. There should be transparency. And we established that in the current research, interviewing people from academia, industry, there's a widespread saying that proponents are very, very averse to disclosing uncertainty when it comes to impact assessment. It should also be cost effective. Specific resources required to reach uncertainty should be commensurate with monitoring of the thresholds. Setting thresholds should also be an objective-led process, right? We have ecological objectives, utility objectives, and compliance objectives. Right. For the ecological objectives, okay, I'll go for the utility objectives. So literature emphasizes the relevance of thresholds and procedure for establishing them as being dependent on utility objectives. This is based on human values, uses, judgments, and requirements, and maximizing these goals and objectives. So what are the implications? What implications do we have? We establish that certain thresholds trigger management actions, and we presume that, sorry, I'll go back on that again. Setting thresholds, setting adaptive management thresholds to trigger management actions presume we understand the environmental assessments and projected impacts and mitigation needs. However, much of these research criticizes the science foundations of environmental assessments. I'll just take some time here, sorry. Okay, so we have a second implication here. The principles and guidance emerging from literature are not mutually exclusive, but rather tightly coupled. In principle, adaptive management serves to reduce uncertainty. There's an inherent assumption that environmental assessment processes disclose uncertainties. However, research indicates that uncertainty disclosures by proponents in the EA, excuse me, can I have some water? So active experimentation is necessary to establish and improve the efficacy of such threshold in adaptive management. So we have next steps. Sorry. So going forward, we are interviewing people who are working in adaptive management. We are looking at literature and lessons alongside all these things. We are looking at foundational issues as well, and we're focusing on extracting this guidance for setting these factors here. Thank you very much for your time.
Okay, so that brings us to the end of session one before the break. We're going to have 2 more presentations afterwards. The break now will be for about 20 minutes. We're going to reconvene at 10:45. So, thanks. Okay, so the 4th presentation is going to be given by Trennon Wint. Trennon is our 2024 Student Bursary Award winner. So, big round of applause for Trennon. And each year, OAIA seeks applications from graduate students to award our bursary. So then there'll be another one for 2025. Trennon has a background in ecology, geography, and public policy. His development as a researcher has been motivated by an interest in the ways the human communities interact with and are affected by the natural world around us. His current work seeks to better inform climate change, adaptation practices in the natural resource sector, with a particular focus on mining operations in the northern context. And his presentation introduces his thesis research, which discusses the challenges of planning for mine closure projects in the context of uncertainties related to climate change. Although focused on the mining industry, this presentation provides insight into the emerging ways to evaluate the impacts climate change has on a variety of projects across Canada. It also emphasizes gaps in the guidance being provided to proponents in terms of building climate resiliency into their plans. There you go.
Alrighty, good morning, everyone. I hope you all are doing well and that you enjoyed your break. As mentioned, my name is Trennon Wint. I'm a first-year Master of Science student at the University of Guelph, enrolled in the Rural Planning and Development program. My current research focuses on the role of climate change adaptation in the natural resource sector with a specific focus on the policies and planning practices involved in the long-term management of post-closure mining sites. The content I'm going to be presenting today forms the basis of my thesis, which I'll be undertaking over the next 2 years at the University of Guelph under the guidance of Dr. Nicholas Brunet. I'd like to make special mention as well, this work has been really graciously supported by the CGSM funding provided by the Social Science and Humanities Research Council of Canada. All right, across Ontario, we talk about mining a lot. That's no surprise. We have 41 active mining projects in the province, as well as 32 that are currently in the planning or exploration phases. Economically speaking, mining is well established in Ontario. In 2022, we produced $13.5 billion worth of minerals, and we're the recipient of nearly a quarter of all Canadian investments in domestic mining activity. Taking into account both direct and indirect forms of employment, the mining sector in Ontario provides jobs for about 47,000 citizens. Now, when we talk about mining, one of the intricacies that often gets lost is that the term mining does not just refer to a single activity. Rather, the concept of mining can be better explained in the concept of like a life stages comprised of the following phases. So we have exploration, planning, development, production, and reclamation. Now, increasingly, we're seeing this recognition of what we call a sixth phase of mining. And that's what we like to call post-closure or long-term management or long-term monitoring or perpetual care. There's a lot of names for it. But what this phase really describes is all the impacts or relationships that persist at a mining site even after the site has been officially closed. Now, generally speaking, when we think about mining, we really think about that production phase. That's where minerals are being extracted from the ground and they're being processed. But that's not the phase that a mine stays in the longest. On average, the production phase of a mine is only about 8 to 40 years. In contrast, a mine that enters into the post-closure phase will be there forever. Now, I already mentioned 32 upcoming mining projects in the province and 41 active mines. What I didn't mention is that the province of Ontario is also home to over 6,100 post-closure mining sites. That means that almost 99% of all past, present, or near future mining sites are closed. Despite this fact, the post-closure phase of mining is notoriously overlooked both by academics and by industry professionals. This has created a very large knowledge gap in our understanding of how the hazards that are left behind at mines impact the social, economic, environmental, and human health conditions of local communities and environments years and generations after a site's official closure. Now, that's not to say that we lack any guidance on how to manage these post-closure mining sites. That's not true. The Federal Contaminated Site Action Plan, also known as the FCSAP, is a really kind of key piece of policy which provides step-by-step instructions on Canada's strategy for closing federally owned contaminated sites. So this includes mines, but it also applies to things like military bases, some water treatment sites, things like that. Now, the framework that's outlined by the FCSAP, it does include provisions related to long-term monitoring of these sites, but of note is that it only applies to federally owned sites. So when we talk about mines in Ontario, maybe about 30% or so. The other big thing to note is that FCSAP does treat all contaminated sites the same. And what that means is that we lose some of that nuance or that specificity when we're talking about mine-specific hazards, so things like landslides or ground instability. I'll also make note to policies like the Ontario Mining Act, and that has some relevance for mine closure, or a lot of relevance, I should say, in the form of the the Mine Rehabilitation Code. And then I'll also make note to the federal and provincial legislations related to impact assessment, as that does have some contextualization related to activities about decommissioning and abandoning mines. Now, I'll stress, this is not by any means a comprehensive list. There are many more policies and acts that do come into play, but this gives you a good introduction to some of the key work that is involved in this post-closure discussion. But why is it important to even talk about post-closure governance? The site's closed, come on. Well, even after reclamation, hazards do remain at mining sites that will last for centuries. And this is really critical to talk about in the context of climate change, because the possibility that a lot of these hazards end up doing harm is very often related to environmental conditions. And I'll give you an example. This is the Giant mine sites in Northwest Territories. It's a gold mine that produced over 200,000 tons of arsenic trioxide during its production. Now, the original plan was to take this arsenic and bury it under permafrost. However, rising temperatures and permafrost thaw in the region have raised some concerns about the strategy. While permafrost levels may be stable in the near future, in the long term, this is likely going to be kind of threatened in the context of decades and centuries of warming. And this is going to leave a lasting threat. Now, we have made impressive progress in addressing climate change in a lot of Canadian projects, but in the context of post-closure mining, we're really just entering this discussion. I introduced the FCSAP on the last slide. They released their first climate adaptation guidance document only 2 years ago, and it provides very minimal practical advice on how to actually implement adaptation strategies in the post-closure phase. As mentioned, the Mining Rehabilitation Code, another really prominent document. It only mentions the term climate once, and it's in terms of selecting the proper plant type to use in revegetation efforts. And then, obviously, as many of you may know, the impact assessment kind of lens with climate change is relatively new. So based on how we treat climate in our current policies, we're left with a post-closure climate adaptation framework that looks something like this. And I will stress this is a Google drawing I made, but it is based on a very, very real document that I read this summer. So let me tell you a little bit about it. So in this example, we focus on an artificial channel that's being left behind at a mine, and that's represented by the black kind of shape on the screen there. And the blue line shows the current water level that's running through this channel. So in order to assess the channel's climate readiness, proponents used local climate data in conjunction with global emission scenarios and projected future kind of channel conditions up into the year 2100, or about 80 years from now. So the orange line shows what might happen to the water levels in a low emissions future. The red line at the top shows what might happen in a high emissions future. Now, generally speaking, all that seems to stay within the capacity of the channel, so we would say, hey, that's a pretty solid plan. However, this approach does have its challenges. Examples like this show how hazards are often evaluated based on single scenarios rather than multiple climate events. For instance, what would happen to this channel if we had rising water levels coupled with increasing temperatures, extreme storms, and wildfires? This is the reality in a lot of situations. Additionally, applying global emission scenarios to a hyper-local context does come with some problems. And maybe most of note is that an 80-year outlook on climate does not always capture the full lifespan of hazards that are being left at mines, especially when we zoom out from a channel idea and we start talking about things like on-site contaminant storage. Now, I do try to avoid critiquing the use of an 80-year outlook, and the reason for that is because I understand how difficult it is to even look that far ahead. While we like to lump our climate scenarios into neat little buckets like low or high emissions, the reality is much more nuanced. The graph behind me shows a number of different future emission scenarios up until the year 2100, and each one of those endpoints is going to have a different impact on the Earth's climate. There are hundreds, if not thousands, up there, and this is by no means comprehensive. There are truly an infinite number of future scenarios, and our ability to predict what might happen to our climate in response to them becomes incredibly challenged the further that we look into time, because the degree of uncertainty it's just too much. However, we are being tasked at sites like this to prepare measures that will perpetually manage hazards at mine sites that will pose risk to communities and the environment even hundreds of generations from now. When we review climate adaptation plans and we're addressing these hazards, we are putting an extraordinary amount of faith in our climate projections. We are hoping that the climate impacts that manifest in 80 years are the worst that they're going to get, and that by addressing the impacts we're seeing in the data, we're protecting communities and the environment for generations to come, despite the immense amount of uncertainty that these come with. There's a quote from a paper my professor worked on earlier this year, and it summarizes my thoughts on the matter pretty well. We must find effective ways to convey the complexities and uncertainties of climate data, ensuring that this is both comprehensive and practical for the decision-making process. So I've spent some time talking about climate change today, but I also want to acknowledge that climate is far from the only consideration that needs attention when we're talking about planning to manage long-lived hazards. there remains significant uncertainty of governance and funding and communication guarantees that we need to make if we are going to ask ourselves to create these perpetual management plans. Now, if all that sounds like a tall order to you, don't worry, it does to me too. It's scary. Planning for what is essentially forever is a completely unprecedented task. We're talking about managing hazards that will survive in perpetuity, but the oldest known human structures that are still standing have only been around for a fraction of a fraction of a fraction of that time. There is pretty much no guidance to look to when we're talking about planning for forever, and that is an immense challenge. Now, I want you to put a little asterisk against that if you're taking notes, and the reason is because we have a very interesting case, and I believe it was just this year, we saw the completion of the first ever storage facility for nuclear waste. So this facility, which was developed in Finland, it may very well represent the very first human structure which was planned to last for what we dream up as forever. When we think about the issues that come with planning for perpetuity, this storage facility that's being developed could very well be an excellent opportunity for us to identify ways to address the concerns we've talked about today. So as I mentioned, this presentation is meant to provide a little bit of context for the thesis work that I'll be undertaking over the next 2 years. The goal of this work is really to begin developing a process to help assess mine closure and post-closure plans for climate readiness and adaptability. In the first phase of my research, my aim is to characterize the state of understanding, conversation, and action on climate adaptation in the post-closure phase of mining. This will first involve a really deep dive into literature, but more importantly and more interestingly, administering a large amount of surveys and having discussions with mining professionals to get an understanding of their challenges and their beliefs and how they see this issue. In the second phase, we're going to move towards a focus on how to actually implement these adaptive strategies into mine closure planning to address some of the concerns that we talked about today. This will include semi-structured interviews with policymakers and industry professionals, but it will also include capacity building activities like workshops and focus groups. Now, I will admit, having only just started my graduate schooling last month, these are a little flexible, let's say. So I do look forward to any conversations that we have, any input on kind of how to guide some of this research over the next 2 years. And with that, I do just want to say thank you for providing me a space to introduce my research and welcoming me to my first OAIA conference. I want to quickly shout out just a few of my project partners whose support has been vital in advancing this research. If anyone is interested in keeping up to date with some project updates, I'm more than happy to connect and share some of the upcoming events and our findings. Otherwise, though, I look forward to our panel session, and I thank you all for being such a gracious audience today.
Thanks so much, Trennon. That was very interesting. So the last presentation now that we have is from David from Stantec. Okay. Great. So David Kielstra is an environmental planner with Stantec, where he specializes in planning for transportation and municipal infrastructure, EAs. David is involved in public and Indigenous engagement for environmental assessments and heritage conservation district projects, as well as socioeconomic impact assessments. He's an RPP and a member of OAIA and served on local municipal committees with a focus on sustainability issues. This presentation, exploring the landscape of post-environmental assessment support, delves into the critical phase between EA approval, detailed design, and project implementation. The lag time between EA approval and project commencement varies widely, raising questions about maintaining confidence amongst changes, such as regulatory requirements, project design, and changing stakeholders. The presentation offers insight to manage uncertainty through adaptive management during the transition from EA completion to project execution.
Thank you very much. Hello, everyone. I'm very excited to be here, and thank you for the OAIA Conference Committee for inviting me here. I'll just update that. A little tall. My topic, as we discussed, is exploring the post-environmental assessment support period. This is, I believe this is a very timely topic, especially within the topic of managing uncertainty. There's a lot of changes that have been happening in the province lately, but also moving into the EA, or moving past the EA is sometimes a little bit of a black box for some of us. So we're going to dive in a little bit. So we already had a brief introduction, but this is a little bit about myself. Environmental planner at Stantec for the past 7 years. Before that, with another consulting firm, and then prior to that, working with an Indigenous engagement firm. So the objectives of this presentation are really focused on the changes from policy and also into detailed design. So the Ontario EA policy ecosystem has undergone a period of tremendous change in recent years, as we all are quite aware. Much of this has been driven by provincial policy changes and EA guideline updates. We're also constantly adapting as a profession as we address growth in the province, while still maintaining a rigorous EA process. This presentation will touch on 3 key themes. So that is recognizing the changing landscape of EAs in Ontario, better aligning our mitigation measures to be more useful in the detailed design processes, and thirdly, to use adaptive management concepts to reframe how we obtain what is needed for permits and approvals. So MECP has been active, which is good to say the least, and they've been releasing in 2023 and 2024 some major revisions to the overall Environmental Assessment Act. There's been 7 Class EAs that have been updated and released and amended. I won't get into all the changes here. I'm sure others will be talking about that as well. You know, some are incorporating other aspects of projects into existing Class EA processes, such as municipal freeways and expressways. Also, there's been some changes to electricity transmission lines and permitting, and bringing those into Class EAs as well. Really, the amendments are seeking to better align with the overall EAA Act, but for our purposes, the 7 Class EAs are going to continue to apply. Many of us have seen this diagram in various shapes or forms, whether in your day-to-day life or as an EA professional. What I really want to focus on, the overall process hasn't been changing that much. Still, there's various schedules and based on how your project will apply. Schedule B and C projects still, for the most part, follow the same process. But I want to focus on that little box under Phase 1. I'm going to. So in the most recent diagrams, there's been an increased focus on more EA exemptions, more projects that fall outside of the EA process and proceed right to detailed design. While this seems like a great idea, and in some cases it is, we can fast track some of these projects. If you do proceed to detailed design, are you missing anything? Are you still getting the answers that you need when you're trying to decide if you need additional studies, or when you are faced with a permitting application that might be daunting? Do you have the information that you need? I'll talk about one other Class EA as another example. So on that one, detailed design, a lot more projects are going to detailed design. For the MTO Class EA, the Class EA was updated in 2024, and there's been updates to recent legislation, which in some cases are overdue, over 24 years. In terms of the practicalities, though, there's a greater focus on the preliminary design report. The primary document would be the Transportation Environmental Study Report. This document is typically prepared in preliminary design and covers projects at a highway corridor level, like over a large area. For instance, there's one tester that was created for the Holland Marsh all the way up to Barrie, for example. When it comes to The finer details, though, of actually implementing a project, given the time scale can be many, many years, what you're lacking with the Tesser, and things need to change a little bit to improve that, is you need the detail necessary for an instance, an interchange project, where you might have finer property issues, access issues, you might have excess soil issues that come into play once you're looking at the project and the area you have to work with. So there's more studies that are needed. They're still going to be happening in detailed design, but we need to be thinking, if that's the only document that the public gets to see, if that's the only document that the designers will have to work with, that you need to make sure that your mitigations make sense and that they can be actually implemented. Now, I'm not going to dive into an interchange project, as it can be pretty complex and all the drawings and that sort of thing. So I decided to pick a bit of a case study that we can work with through this talk, related to a smaller bridge project, just to follow an EA that we worked on through into permitting and into an implementation. So this project here is, if you can kind of see the map, on the border of Hamilton and Burlington. It was the Valley Inn Bridge. I'll show you a picture in a second. It's near Royal Botanical Gardens. If there's any runners in the room, you might know it as the Clickety-Clack Bridge, because it was famously part of the Around the Bay race in the Hamilton area. You can see why. It was pretty old and rickety when we're actually when we got to site. The actual bridge is a former Bailey Bridge. You can kind of see the struts on the bottom there. It's missing the upper portions of the bridge, but it was in place for many, many years, where it was identified as a heritage structure. So, like I said, Stantec completed the EA in 2021. We followed many of the typical approaches, which in terms of following the municipal class EA steps, we developed alternative solutions and identified some mitigation measures. One of the things that we did, though, that was something that we really like to do, is a detailed design commitments table at the end. So the table excerpt there, I'm not making you squint, you don't have to copy this stuff down, but essentially it's a forward-looking table, so separate from the mitigation table, for commitments or things that might change in design. There's some assumptions that you make during the EA, but if those don't bear out, or the project can't actually construct it in that way, if it's providing a little bit of flexibility, or like if this isn't the case, then you need to do this, right? So it's a table that way. So we're just going to follow through a few examples from that. So once the EA is done, that's the end of the road, right? Obviously not. After an EA is completed, EA commitments must be integrated into the project design and the tender documents. Then permits must be obtained, and then consultation continues. You might have additional engagement with residents around detour routes or construction notifications. You might have additional agency engagements as part of the permitting process, and also Indigenous communities. If there's leftover issues that still need to be resolved, or if you're doing further archaeological studies, among other reasons. This can be a complicated process whereby EA commitments are transferred to designers and then a contractor. So what I'm challenging us to do in the next couple of slides is to think like a designer. Don't think like it's the end of the road. Think about the contractor's perspective. Is the mitigation actually something that can be implemented? What do they need from us? So I've seen a lot of EA commitments, and often I see a lot of vague language, or this issue will be treated in detailed design. We're trying to move away from that a little bit. Where an EA is no longer completed, proponents or municipal project teams might have limited information to work with, and may not know exactly the steps involved and where to start with approvals. So we're trying to manage that uncertainty. So here's a couple commitment pitfalls that we see from time to time. So there's kind of three categories here: vague and unclear requirements, lacking construction details, or no contingency. So I have some examples. So statements like will be determined in detailed design or further consultation should be conducted. That's great, but the contractor may not be aware of when to apply the mitigation or what to do or what form they need to do. So providing a little bit more clarity there would be helpful. Lacking construction details. So examples such as the contractor will develop a plan to address excess materials. Or erosion and sediment controls will be used. You know, what type, when, in what context, right? I don't know if you've seen some of these languages or you're using them yourself, but you know, it can be frustrating when trying to implement. And then finally, no contingency. So the project will avoid, you know, a very firm statement will avoid timing windows for migratory birds, or no in-water work will be allowed. You know, that's all well and good in the planning stage, but if, for example, a contract gets delayed too far, or you know, it gets deferred for a few years, or funding's only available at certain times, that can be really restrictive. And I think having a fallback option, for example, for the timing windows, you know, providing what to do if, you know, nest searches, that sort of thing, to not be too prescriptive. So on this slide, I have a few commitment best practice, sort of some tips that you can use when developing mitigation measures. So, and then I'll show you an example. So some use action-oriented language that, you know, will do or must do where it absolutely can't change, you know, that's a good option. Referencing legislation or guidance documents if they're available. For instance, if you're you know, doing some work with bats, or you know, there's specific approaches to tarping for a bridge, you know, identify those things so the contractor can actually use that. Identifying relevant timing windows, actually listing the windows and when you want things installed. Types of technology required, for instance, types of fencing. You know, don't just say sediment fencing, but say an actual type of fencing if you want it to protect for reptiles, for instance. You know, and then time duration. You know, when should the fencing be installed, for instance? Always good to identify. So, going back to our example of the table, we've got an example of action-oriented language for, you know, the work in the water. You know, because there's, you know, that this in-water work will be evaluated according to the criteria checklist. So that's important there. Referencing guidance materials, so that's also the checklist. In terms of cultural heritage, you're actually, in this case, we are identifying specific requirements given that it was a heritage bridge for a documentation report, and how to store and preserve the panel, like a portion of the panels. So describing next steps. In terms of adaptive management, we already had a great talk on it earlier today, so I won't dwell on it too much, but there are a number of great examples and definitions of adaptive management, but at its core, adaptive management is trying to be systematic and flexible in the face of change. So the example that I really like is Government of British Columbia. Adaptive management is a systematic process for continually improving management policies and practices and outcomes. And Impact Assessment Agency of Canada, they really stress the flexibility and continuous improvement. In terms of how, you know, to focus on the applicability of this, as I said before, we need to be thinking like a designer or a contractor. Do we have the required permits? Are there offsets that are needed to protect a habitat? If there are, provide those in the document. Monitoring and mitigation effectiveness. Is there a contingency if a new nest is found? That's always a great idea, having some contingency measures. And so for Valley Inn Bridge, some of the activities we did to transition from the EA into design work and the construction was late in the EA process. We had a call with the Conservation Authority planners. Given it was a multi-jurisdictional situation, it was a great idea to confirm the permitting rather than just to leave it to the contractor to decide or the client. So we had a call and really we fleshed out the details of what would be required and then translated those right into our documentation. For cultural heritage, we had some studies ongoing, and we included a recommendation for a documentation and salvage report with specific requirements the contractor needed to take to preserve the structure. We didn't want them to go too far down the road of replacing the bridge and then, oops, you needed to keep a panel or two, to preserve it. So we wanted to be very specific there. Then we moved into the permit package preparation, where we drew on some previous documentation and mapping and figures through Conservation Halton. And then finally integrated the EA commitments directly into the drawings as much as we possibly could. So you might be wondering how some of those mitigations sometimes end up in the contractor's hands. This is just an example of a bridge diagram where some of the commitments we talked about earlier made it into the notes section on the right-hand side. So, in this case, it was very, very clear that the contractor did not want, or the client did not want in-water work to preserve the structure as much as possible. We weren't addressing the abutments either, so we could do that, but we made it very clear that way. And then the cultural heritage aspect I mentioned before was translated right onto the design drawings. And things like tree protections are also included there too. So all this is great when you have a nice document to work with, and you have the table, and you can move right into design and move forward. But what if I am EA exempt? What if my project skipped a lot of these steps? What can you do? So even though you may not need to prepare an EA document or EA evaluation tables or anything like that any longer for some of those projects, the other legislation hasn't necessarily kept up. You still do need to address or think about things like impacting potential archaeological areas. If the bridge is older, you do need to think about some of these things and consider whether even though there may not be an EA, whether you do need some additional support when it comes time to preparing a permitting document, because the conservation authorities or other, others like DFO, they may ask for some of this stuff, and then you don't want to be sitting there and have project delays. So I have listed a few types of studies that might be required. Things like an environmental impact study, for instance, might be still required in your official plan. So you do need to consider these things, and it's worth asking the right questions and asking a planner or at any firm really about whether it applies to your project or not. One other way to keep track of all of the moving parts for your project, even without an EA, is to keep a good log and keep good records. So a risk register or a permitting log, as some people call it as well, is a really good proactive approach for keeping your data in line. With a risk register, the goal is to identify risks early on in a project and to start identifying strategies that may resolve them or minimize them. Think how we mitigate things. In this case, you're kind of mitigating risk, and that can take the form of further studies, but it can also take the forms of further consultation. So they're really great tools. In many cases, organizations that have ISO processes may have examples of risk registers within your company already. So think of it as something that you could apply to the EA, like a post-EA process as well, or detailed design to keep track. The goal is to reduce unforeseen risks to the extent possible. I'll just show you a quick example of what a risk register might be. So rather than an EA table, it also has some categories for probability of risk, an impact level that's assumed, and this can be in flux as the project proceeds. In the case of one project I was involved in, we did this as a workshop early on to identify, have client representatives, have consulting representatives there to identify what are the things keeping you up at night about your project, what are the things that are unknowns. How can we resolve those? How can we address those? What more information do you need? So that's the goal here, and you can start to flesh out some of the risks for the projects and start fleshing out who you need to talk to try to address those. In this case, there was some, this is just an example, but like you might need a permitting form, information gathering forms, or other things like that, or if there's aquatic habitat, staying away. So it's just an alternative to an EA document. And just as I'm wrapping up, I'll just show you the end product for that bridge. So previously it was pretty rickety. I don't know if it has the clickety-clack anymore, but it's still, it looks pretty good. So Stantec did the EA and environmental permitting support, but I do want to acknowledge RV Anderson did the bridge design, and we worked side by side with them to help integrate environmental commitments into that document. And if you squint towards the back, you can see a portion of the bridge panel that was kept. And I think there's some interpretive signage there as well. You can't really see it there, but trying to preserve the heritage and give a sense of the place that the bridge is in. So just wrapping up, I just want to leave you with some takeaways. The EA processes are changing, but information is still needed in detailed design and permits. I challenge you to work with the end in mind. Think like a designer or a contractor when making your mitigation plans. Use a risk register or permit tracking log if you can to identify potential complications or challenges for your project to reduce permitting delays. Provide examples where it's possible. It's not always possible, but if you can, if this happens, then those statements are helpful in case things unforeseen happen. Making contingency plans, always staying adaptive and flexible is always a good strategy as well. And then finally, in some of our larger projects, we often will share the design details with the contract administrator group within our firm to have a second set of eyes on the document, to think about it from that contractor perspective, and to think about constructability. We can design some great stuff, but if you can't actually do it in the field, there's some challenges. So we want to know about those things beforehand. And with that, thank you very much for your time, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.
Thank you very much. So now we're going to get into the Q&A portion of session 1. Valentine, do you want to come up and sit with the rest of the panel? Okay, so for the Q&A portion, we have 2 microphones at the back of the room. Please feel free to come over and ask questions. Nope, right there. Yep, you. There's an extra chair right here. There's a chair right here. So I'll invite anybody that wants to come and ask a question. I'm sure that there's some interesting topics people want to discuss after the presentations.
Yeah, hi. This one's for Kimberly. I was interested about the use of the drones, particularly when PTEs, permits to enter, are hard to come by or obtain. Have you experienced any difficulties in the past, or are there permits required for the use of drone technology over private property?
That's a really good question, and that's something that we're still trying to navigate. There are certain classes of UAVs that do require certain types of permitting, airspace, that kind of thing. So I think one of the challenges that we kind of have to overcome is incorporating what type of UAV you're planning to use for your project and how you're planning to use it, because there's different classes and sizes. But also, when we're thinking about PTEs, for example, on over airspace, is what's the context? Is it in an urban? Is it rural? Is it along a rail corridor? Is it infrastructure? So those are all the things that, you know, as part of the innovation, you know, as it advances, we're going to start answering those questions. But until we start using them, or going beyond than what we're currently using now, we're not going to be able to get those answers, and we're not going to be able to get over that hurdle. And so we start challenging ourselves to say, well, let's get those answers as part of our project. Let's not wait, you know, 5 or 10 years, you know, while somebody else figures it out. We have to take that initiative to try to figure it out for ourselves as we work on projects.
Thanks. Any other questions from? Yep.
This is time shorter. David, your presentation was really interesting, and I think it brings some challenges that the broader industry faces. I come at it from the hydroelectric world, where we use a lot on our teams a thing called when you do an EA and you finish the EA, whether it's a screening document or just the regular Class B, because we are in a Class EA, create what's called a commitments document. And that lists all the commitments that you've got from everything. You put it there for construction and commitments for operations. And then you hand that to when you have the contract and you hire the constructor, you give it to them and you say, this must be in your site-specific environmental management plan. And then you audit that plan during construction. So that's sort of like how you can make sure that they're not empty promises. So it's something I would just suggest. It may work in other sectors like transportation and the items you were looking at. So I think maybe the bigger question for us as a group is, how do the different sectors collaborate? Because maybe what we do in hydro, we can learn something from mining. There was a really interesting discussion there, or transportation, etc. So that's just something, I think that collaboration is probably not a bad idea.
Hello. Is that one on? Yeah, when you create your permitting log, you take a strategic approach to applying for the permits and just apply for them when you need them, or do you advise just applying for them all at once and, like, as a block, like, find out all the permits you need and apply for them?
I think the answer to that is you need to look at the length of time some of these take. Like, some of them take quite a long time, you know, for some species at risk permits, you know, sometimes you're looking at like 18 months, right? So it really depends on the project that you have and what you're, you know, what makes the most sense for those, like to prioritize those. But, you know, I think in detailed design, things do tend to change, so you may not want to apply all at once, but give some time to work through the projects, and then and work backwards from those timelines. I think that's the main thing.
All right, thanks.
This is perhaps a question for Trennon. Thanks so much for your presentation. It was really really interesting. And I know you're still fairly early on in your journey through this stage of your academic career. But I'm wondering, sort of when thinking about post-closure planning, especially generations into the future, how should we conceptualize the role of adaptive management when there may not be a proponent, there may not be a company still around, and especially not staff to take those direct actions? How do we even begin to have those conversations?
Yeah, it's a really great question, and it's something that we mull over all the time. When we think about post-closure and what's going to happen in generations to come, my advisor always talks about the extremes. Even in the case of legislative boundaries change. What were countries, or what are countries today are not necessarily countries that were existing 100 years ago. So even our regulatory process changes. One of the things that we deal with a lot in NWT is building local capacity, because that is the thing that we can be the most confident will stay the same. So involving local stakeholders, rights holders, building that into the process. And when we talk about building in a plan, I think, I talk a lot about what makes a good plan. And I think in the context of work, people get really hung up on, the plans that we make, they need to be right the first time, and they need to accurately predict everything that's going to happen. And I would argue that's not realistic. I would argue it's maybe not fair to put that burden on ourselves. What I would say is that the hallmark of an adaptive plan, the hallmark of a plan that is good in this context, is not necessarily being right from the get-go, but building in provisions assuming we will be wrong, because the odds are we will be wrong.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Kind of a similar question I had too on the mining. I lived up north in a small town, and back in the early 90s we had an unusual warm spring, lots of rain, and beavers built dams, and this particular year the dam broke and it washed out a whole tiling pile and flooded our river, which was our source of water at the time. Now all of these old mines, you mentioned quite a big number of those abandoned mines. Now those back in the day, we didn't have the standards we have now. Are all of those old mines that could potentially be a hazard, have they ever been looked at to see what needs to be done so these similar disasters don't happen?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So forgive me because I don't remember the dates off the top of my head, but mine closure plans were only mandated recently. I want to say in BC it was in 95. The earliest was back in US in 77. So any of the mines before then likely don't have these long-term management plans, although I'm open to being wrong there, I'll admit. So yeah, there is potential. I would say one of the cool things about the research that I'm looking to do is we're using a planning tool called Plan Evaluation, which is just what it sounds like. It's a tool to assess the quality of a plan. And we're using it to assess the quality of mine closure plans in the context of climate adaptation. And one of the things that we're really excited about is, like things like LEED certification, this can be used proactively. So a company that's making a mine closure plan can look to it for reference. But the thing that I'm very interested to see is applying it retrospectively. So taking a look at mines that have already closed and assessing the current plans that are in place to assess their adaptability and their climate readiness to get an idea of the risks that are presented there.
Thank you.
Yes?
I'm listening to you talk about check boxes and are things in order. You ask yourself these questions. My question is, when do you address the spirit of the earth and the trees and the rocks? Because in my culture, we do that first. We explain to those things that we're going to be working with, what we want and what we're intending to do. And this will often assist the process in going more smoothly. So when will there be a checkoff for the things you're going to be working with. That can be for anyone.
Yeah, sure.
Sure, go ahead.
Thank you for that question. I think that's a very good question. I acknowledge that in my research, when I was talking about science as foundational to setting threshold, right? I talked about science and talked about indigenous rights and values as necessary for setting thresholds. Yeah, so I see that you want it to come from a more equalistic basis, right? So probably we can look at them on equal basis and see how they integrate together, right, as being necessary for setting thresholds. Right? There's a science foundation, there are values, and there are indigenous rights as well, and indigenous knowledge has been very necessary for setting thresholds in adaptive management. Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you very much for that.
That is key, I think, to doing a complete job. We're not asking you to practice religion. We're asking you to acknowledge those things you're going to be managing. Miigwech.
Thank you.
I just had a comment that it was where proponents don't know what they don't know, right? And I think that what you brought up forward about the spirit of the land, understanding where you're going and what you're treading on in your impact is something that's why relationships are so critical. Relationships are so critical from the outset. Relationships are so critical moving forward, and that I think the intentionality is critical. So what you're saying, you know, there are lots of proponents I work with who want to be there and at that stage, and then some of them don't know how, some of them are there. It just is dependent, and I just want to acknowledge and thank you for that comment.
Thank you. Okay. Yeah.
So I actually want to acknowledge David's presentation, which from my TRCA perspective, which I manage a group of planners and the technical reviewers and the environment, you presented a perfect process. It was perfect. Everything you said is our dream, but I'm going to challenge you to add to that process and to add the spirituality and how do you incorporate the spirit of the land, the water, the rocks, the animals into the upfront piece of why we need to do something, to build something, to have infrastructure. So I challenge you to add that piece to your thought and your planning and your process.
Thank you. Kim, I think you wanted to say something before lunch?
And just to follow up with what you're saying is, I want to challenge everybody in this room, right? We're regulators, we're consultants, we're developers of RFPs. We need to start thinking about the adaptive changes and the innovations tools that are available to us right now, and our hesitancy to include them, right? Because there's not a lot of, proof of concept in some areas, for example, eDNA, but we're not going to get over those hurdles unless we as a group challenge ourselves to say, yes, I want to include this in this project, or I want to ask that question, especially as innovation and technology is advancing, and we can slowly remove some of those gaps and uncertainties only if we're willing to take those first steps. So I challenge that to everybody in this room as well.
Kim, I think your presentation highlighted the need that we just dive in. We have to dive in and start trying. And we're not going to get it, everything's not going to be perfect. Things are not always going to work exactly as we anticipate. But that was one of the things that when you were talking about how innovative and the capacity that we're going to have to do new things, that we just have to start trying. And in the nuclear sector, it's a similar thing, that we have to start building new types of reactors and figuring those things out. And some of the problems we are things similar in the mining sector, and with adaptive management, we have to adapt, we have to try. and we have to sort of support each other to make it as the best as we can. Sorry, trying to find it. It was a unifying thread, I think, we all had, which is probably the intention of the conference organizers. This is why they put us all together. But anyways.
Thank you. You have a question, or?
Don't worry, I'll be good. I'll be good. Don't you worry. So we did actually speak about capacity of nations, right? I always find it entertaining when people speak nations don't have capacity to do much. But you just openly admitted that I have to be an expert on nuclear reactors. I have to be an expert in oil and gas lines. I'm an expert in mining. And honestly, I am. But you can't answer the simplest question that my elder passed on. What about the spirituality of our inherent rights? Right? That is something I challenge you all to do, because you don't even know the fundamentals of how you got to be here as Canadians, right? By understanding Section 35 of our inherent rights and our treaty rights, but yet you talk about our capacity to understand your processes. So start thinking like that now, right? And I'll be good till tomorrow.
Thank you for that comment, and I apologize if that, I think when I think about the capacity comment is something that I think we have in our industry quite a lot, and we say it a lot, and it's more that do we have are we doing the right thing? You know, how do we do this the right way? How do we need to know these things, apparently according to regulation and all of these things, but more importantly, I think it's about relationships, which I said before. And so how do you build a relationship? How do you check boxes? How do you do all these things? And how do you learn about the land in a good way? And I don't think if any of us said we had an answer to all of it, I think we'd have it would be problematic, because we would be lying probably, right? We would be saying, and I can tell you, I'm not an expert in many things. I'm an expert in some very tiny, small things, and most of the time I rely on the expertise of everybody else in the room. And so that's sort of how I see these relationships, but again, I defer.
Okay, I think this is a great time now to pass it off for lunch. So, David, if you want to come up and say some remarks before the lunch break.
Thanks, Sarah. Yeah, oh, you bet. Okay, sure. So yeah, some great sessions this morning, some great questions. Thanks to our moderator, Sarah, and to our presenters in session number 1. Thank you to our gold sponsors who sponsored session number 1, Stantec. I lost it there. Stantec, HDR, Jacobs, and TRCA. We are going to break for lunch, but right before that, just trying to find the slide, we had another question, since we're 30 years of Ontario Association for Impact Assessment. We'll get there. Are we there? There we go. Okay, so the QR code is going to come up. So what we're looking for this time is what was the assessment process that had the most active public participation or Indigenous collaboration consultation that you worked on in your professional career? The good, the bad, the not so great. You know, maybe you had a session where people stood up and clapped and cheered and said, that's the best public engagement I've ever had. Maybe you've been lucky enough to start a grassroots campaign after your public meeting. We want to hear about all those experiences. All experiences are learning opportunities. A couple of things to note as well too. We do have a social at after today at 5 p.m. So hang around, a social network time for you. Students that are here, really encourage you to attend as well and have a chat with individuals in the room. We're going to come back at 12:45 for the start of session number 2. I just want to mention for lunch, if we can allow for elders and veterans to be able to go up first. So let's give them some space for grabbing lunch. And Beth, you had something you wanted to say as well?
I'm actually going to invite Jaga Matenowicz back to the podium. He's going to explain to us what a spirit plate is, and as he does this, Heidi is going to create the spirit plate.
When we gather in groups like this, especially this size, we eat, we feast, and we think about all those people who shaped us to get us to where we are today. Our grandmothers, our grandfathers, our aunts and uncles, teachers. Their spirits still linger around us. In our belief system, we don't put our people away in a room and forget about them. In our system, we keep our relatives around so that they might assist us and remind us of those things that we often forget. And so we honor those people by creating a spirit plate, which Heidi will be doing over there. And the first thing to go on the spirit plate is tobacco. Tobacco always goes first. Because it's a spirit realm, and we're talking about spirits, they don't need a plate full like one of us might have. It just needs to be tiny little bits that will give them a remembrance of the flavors that they've left behind, so that they will come again and be with us when we gather and help us with what we have to do. That's how I understand the spirit plate. And I want to thank you all once again for listening and participating in this kind of talk. It's important. Miigwech. We would also be most thankful for the people who prepared this food for us. Those hands that prepared this luncheon. Their spirits are right here with us. They're right here with us. And I think it's important that we acknowledge the effort that they put into taking care of us.
Miigwech. I'd like to invite now the elders and any veterans to start the buffet, and then everybody else can join.
About the spirit plate, there's more to it than I told you. And the explanation to me was we're all learning here in this room. And I too am learning with you. But I'd like now to let you know that we'll take that spirit plate and we'll take it outside and we'll offer it to the elements and the creatures. And when we go back for that plate, it probably will be empty. So think of your ancestors as you eat. and your loved ones. Okay? And we'll take care of the spear then. Miguel.